Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for May 4th, 2023. Let me begin by saying I heard from a number of regular viewers that you were having trouble finding yesterday's update, which was Zbigniew Part 2, which was a further review of the policies of Zbigniew Brzezinski, which are behind the war hawks currently plunging the US and NATO into World War III. It apparently was misplaced on Facebook. I don't know by who, but instead of the usual 20 to 25,000 views, there were less than 2,000. So if you couldn't find it, and if you can't find the updates, go to the site thelaroucheorganization.com. Click on the box for programs, and the top line there is Harley's Daily Updates, and that's where you can find the updates if they're not there. Because clearly someone doesn't want you to find out more about Brzezinski and his relationship with people like Blinken, Sullivan, and Nuland. Now, speaking of Blinken, he yesterday made a promise that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is coming and that Ukraine is better prepared to regain territory now. Now, think about that comment in the context of what happened yesterday. 2 drones that were approaching the Kremlin were shot down. The drones were described by the Kremlin as a terror attack, an assassination attempt. Putin was not there at the time, but the drones were targeting where his office is and where sometimes they think he spends the night. He wasn't hurt, but the Kremlin definitely described this as a Kiev-launched terror attack. Now, the line from Kiev was very different. We have from Zelensky's spokesman, Nikiforov, that Ukraine, quote, does not have any information about the so-called night attacks on the Kremlin, unquote. Mikhailo Podolyak, who's the head of the Ukrainian presidential office, was more direct. He said Ukraine has nothing to do with the drone attacks on the Kremlin, and he said that he hypothesized that some unspecified local resistance forces within Russia may have been involved. Zelensky himself was in Finland, and he first said Ukraine does not have enough ammunition to carry out such an attack, which is clearly an apocryphal comment given that there were only 2 drones that were involved in this thing. But then he said Ukraine doesn't send teams into Russia or fire missiles or drones into Russia. We didn't attack Putin, he said. We fight on our territory, defending our villages and cities. Then he said that maybe Putin fired the drones on his own residences because he said Russia has no victories to report and that Putin has to do, quote, some unexpected moves like surprise drone attacks to take away from the failure of Russia in Ukraine. Now, the idea that Russia did it echoes what we heard about the shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, where Russian soldiers were in the plant, and yet Ukraine insisted that Russia was shelling the plant. How about Russia sabotaged their own pipelines, the North Sea pipelines? And now there's discussion that this is probably a new false flag attack, which of course is coming from the US Warhawk media. I'll just give you one example from the Atlantic Daily. An article saying it was most likely a Russian false flag operation. They quoted Podolyak saying that Russia could be preparing a large-scale terrorist provocation. And the article concludes by saying, we should brace for what's coming from Russia's desperate dictator, unquote. And the article continues, Russia's looking for an excuse for a new escalation. The article was titled, A Possible False Flag. Now, on the question of a false flag, and of course this is what Blinken was saying, we have from Larry Johnson, a CIA veteran and one of the co-founders of the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. He was appearing with Judge Napolitano yesterday, and he described the attack as a grievous mistake by Kiev because he said it can only galvanize Russians. And he said that Kiev is acting out of desperation. He said that the gamble is that they might provoke Russia to lash out, but he said that there may be angry comments coming from Russia, but Putin and the military will remain cool and collected. They won't lash out. Now, we have from Scott Ritter raising the question of the Ukrainians who were talking about attacking the Victory Day celebration on May 9th in Moscow. Now, this is an important day for Russia. It's the end of the World War II from the Russian standpoint, May 9th, the victory over the Nazis. Now, why would the Ukrainians target a celebration that is commemorating a victory over the Nazis? Well, just remember the important role of the Nazi movement within Ukraine today in the Azov Battalion, the Aidar Battalion, and inside the security and defense forces. But Ritter compared this, the Ukrainians talking about an attack on Moscow on May 9th, he compared it to Biden announcing that the Nord Stream pipeline would be stopped if Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, on that point, we have from Hedeschenko, who is the co-founder of Mirotvorets, which is the kill list that's put out by the Ukrainian government. He sent out 15 tweets yesterday, just totally enthusiastic about the attack. He said that there will be drones that will fall on the May 9th Victory Day parade if they do not cancel it. That's what Ritter was referring to. And he said, the question now is, will Russia cancel the parade on May 9th, or will they wait for a drone during it? So that in itself is not proof. The Russians have the drone parts. They'll be doing an investigation. But here we see the reckless statements coming out of Kiev, even as the president is denying it. Now, Blinken, of course, said that anything that comes from the Kremlin should be, quote, taken with a very large shaker of salt, unquote. The same Blinken who is saying the Ukrainian counteroffensive is coming. And he's, quote, confident they will have success in regaining more of their territory, unquote. Well, with more than $100 billion of U.S. money flowing into Ukraine, of course he'd say that. Otherwise, it makes him a spokesman for one of the largest military failures in recent U.S. history. And there have been a lot of failures in recent history. Well, what would you expect him to say? But outside of Washington and Brussels and maybe London, Blinken has no credibility. The Pentagon leaks show that the U.S. military officials don't believe Ukraine can carry out a successful counteroffensive. What Blinken said about that, trying to explain it away, is that, well, those leaks were from March. The situation has changed. That much? But think of who Blinken is. He's the leading bully of the United States, touring the world to try to force countries, especially in the global south, to join with NATO and the U.S. against Russia. But there's no support for U.S. sanctions. He went to Africa, several countries in Africa, but not a single African country is supporting the sanctions against Russia. When he went to South Africa and confronted the foreign minister, Naledi Pandor, she rebuffed his threats and said, Mr. Secretary, we are a sovereign nation. Don't come here to bully us. Now, Blinken, on top of everything else, is a world-class hypocrite. Yesterday, on World Press Freedom Day, at an event at the Washington Post, after extolling the great virtues of America's freedom of the press, which, of course, his administration and its collaborators are suppressing. And in fact, he may have played a key role in the phony story from U.S. intelligence about the Hunter Biden laptop, that it was Russian disinformation. As Blinken was going on about how great American free press is, he refused to answer a question about how he can talk about press freedom when the U.S. is extraditing Julian Assange, whose freedom was taken away when he exposed the corruption, the murderous corruption of the U.S. war in Afghanistan and Iraq by publishing U.S. documents. Now, Helga Zepp-LaRouche has just issued a statement calling for the release of Assange, and that will be linked at the bottom of today's description page. Now, Blinken also had some comments about China's peace plan, which, of course, he and his administration have rejected. He called it a, quote, cynical trap, unquote, designed to give Russia time to rebuild its military and rearm. Now, at the same time, Blinken is accusing Russia of doing that, or China of doing that. Politico reported that some U.S. officials are proposing to Ukraine that they accept a ceasefire to use the time to rebuild their army to take territory back at some later time. Now, this just echoes the lying treachery of the U.S. approach to the Minsk II Accord, which, as Merkel and Hollande, the Chancellor of Germany and the President of France, admitted, was a ploy to gain time for Ukraine to arm to go to war against Russia. And finally, besides being a hypocrite, Blinken is a war criminal. He's defending sanctions that are killing people all over the world. In particular, he defended the sanctions against Syria, which have taken an enormous toll, especially among children, including after the earthquake, when the U.S. refused to lift the sanctions. And Blinken actually had the gall to say, he's so concerned about the children of Syria that we have to keep the sanctions to stop the Assad regime. In other words, for regime change, punishing children for the success of Syria in resisting the U.S.-sponsored regime change there. So that's why we have to speak out. We can't allow the truth to be crushed by hypocrites and killers of the U.S. military-industrial complex on behalf of the corporate cartels that run them. These kinds of cold-blooded puppets, like Blinken, have to be called out, as we've been doing. Now, tomorrow's Friday. I'll take your questions. Please send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com. And again, if you can't find our videos in the usual places, go to the LaRoucheOrganization.com, click on Programs, and then Harley's Daily Updates, and they'll be there, at least for now. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you tomorrow.